Good Vach we are on Sadi Tes Amud Beis. Today we will have a bunch of what I guess we call like mind benders. Is that the word? Like a bunch of very complicated questions. That's going to cause a little bit not so practical, but interesting conceptual questions. So Amar of Miyasha, first of those questions. By Rav Yochanan asked the following question: Kosel b'shus around. Let's say you have a wall in the public domain. Kavoa Sara v'inaracha barba. It's 10 tefachim high. Okay, so it's 10 tefachim high, which is the size of 10 tefachim high, but it's not 4 tefachim wide. So normally, such a place, imagine like a pillar that's 10 tefachim high, so it's about yay big off the floor, and it's 4 wide. It's not 4 wide, okay. And so typically that would be called a makom patur, a place of exemption. Meaning, if I take something from a public domain and I place it on that, I'm going to be exempt. If I take something from a private domain and place it on that, I'm going to be exempt. However, this wall, now if the wall was 4 tefachim wide, then it would be considered a private domain, a full-fledged private domain. If I take something from a public domain and place it on that pillar, then I'd be chayav. But this pillar happens to be less than 4 tefachim, so I'd be exempt. However, this wall surrounds a karmelis, which is not a public domain, and makes it into a private domain, right? So imagine you're on the 695, okay, full-fledged public domain. At the edge of the public domain, you have like the side of the road, which is called a karmelis. It's not a full-fledged Rishus Rabim, and you have a wall there. The wall there is thin, in which case it's really would be a makom patur. However, it walls in, it encompasses a space, and therefore making that space a Rishus Yachid. So the wall itself is not considered Rishus Yachid, was not on its own would not be considered Rishus Yachid, but it's acting as a wall for the rest of for creating a private domain. So ask the Gemara, or ask Rav Yochanan, v'zarg v'nachal gabo. If a person takes something in the public domain and throws an object and it lands on top of that wall, mahu, what's halacha? Mi amrinan came into Eino Rachav Rabba. Do we say that since the wall itself is not 4 tefachim wide, makom paturhu, therefore it's an exempt area? Odilma came into Sar Rishus Yachid, since the wall is making the area behind it into a private domain, kamad maladamya, it's as if it's filled up. In other words, it's as if that wall has the proper dimensions, and it's as if it is a private domain itself. Amar Ula says kavachomer lacher mos mechitza. For others, it makes it into it forms a partition for other areas. It makes it into a private domain for other areas. So it for sure it itself is going to be considered a private domain, right? And therefore he concludes that even though the wall itself does not have the dimensions of a private domain, since it's a wall adjacent and creating a private domain, it therefore is considered a private domain, even though it doesn't have the proper dimensions. It's Marnami. We have a teaching of another Amora which says this very clearly. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav v'chein Amar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav Yochanan Kosla b'shus aram gavoa sar ve'eino rachav arba. You have a wall in the public domain that is 10 tefachim high, but not 4 tefachim wide. Mukaf the karmelis v'sar rishus yachid. It surrounds a karmelis, and it makes the karmelis into a full-fledged private domain. Hazor v'nachal gabav chayiv. A person throws an object from the public domain and lands on top of this wall, you are chayiv lachem os mechitza. Why? Because for others, it makes it into a proper wall. It makes it into a full-fledged partition, making the area behind it a private domain. La'asma kolshkein, for itself, would it not? For sure it does. Okay. By Rav Yochanan asked the following another question. Bar Tisha, let's say you have a pit which is 9 tefachim deep. Okay, so let's pause for a second. If you imagine you're on a highway, it's a full-fledged public domain, and you have maybe in New York where they have like major potholes. Okay, so imagine you're driving on the highway in New York and there's this pothole which is 10 tefachim deep. It's pretty deep. It's not a pothole. Okay, it's 10 tefachim deep and it's 4 tefachim wide. That's called a private domain. That's a full-fledged private domain in the middle of the public domain. If you were to go ahead and place an object from the highway into that pit, if it's 4 by 10, okay, you'd be chayiv because you went from public domain to private domain. But this pit is 9 tefachim deep. 9 tefachim is not a private domain. Okay, but the person goes ahead, they put their hand into that pit, and they pick up some dirt, a tefach's worth of dirt. And by doing so, they made the pit into 10 tefachim, and then they go ahead and they take that clump of dirt they just pulled out, and they place it on the side of the road in the Rishus Rabim. So they took it out of a pit which, when they pulled from it, it was not yet a Rishus Yachid, but as they pulled it, it becomes a Rishus Yachid because by removing that dirt, it now creates the 10 tefachim of depth which is needed, and you take that dirt and you place it on the side of into Rishus Rabim. So Mahu, what's the halacha? Do we say, since this lifting of the object and the formation of the new dimension of creating this into a private domain, they all happen at the same time, do we say the person is therefore liable or not? In other words, do we say they're liable since at the end of the day they took it from a private domain and moved it into a public domain? Or do we say that since at the same time they took it, it was not yet a private domain, it happened at the same time, it wasn't yet a private domain, therefore you're not going to be chayiv? Okay? And if you want to say that since there was no 10 tefachim when the person initially was doing the akir, when they pulled it out, lo mechayiv, therefore you're not liable. But what about the following case? Barasar, let's say you have a pit which is 10. Now it's 10, so it's a full-fledged Rishus Yachid. And a person places a clod of earth from the public domain into it. So you're going from the public now into the private domain, and now miata, and therefore you're making this 10 tefach pit smaller. You're making it into mekom patur. Okay, so hanachas chevetz v'silim mechitz b'adadika asum mechayiv l'mechayiv. And now over here it's the opposite. Over here you went from a public domain, and as you're putting it in, it was a private domain, but by the time it hit the ground, it became an actual mekom patur, a place which is not a public domain, and therefore maybe you're exempt. Again, it's happening simultaneously. Now the Mefarshim, Tosfos asked, like, isn't this question really the same question as the first question? What's novel about this question? So if you're paying attention, you'll notice the first question was about akira, right? There's two steps when it comes to transfer of objects. There is the lifting up. I lift up an object from this surface, that's akira, and then hanacha is when I put it down. Okay, this camera's not covering enough of what I need to cover. Okay, I put it down onto a new place, and that's called the hanacha. So Tosfos says when it comes to akira, perhaps you need something more substantive, something much more concrete to be considered an akira, and therefore maybe there is more of a reason to say when the akira and the formation of the domain were happening at the same time, there's more of a reason to say we don't see them all happening at once. But when it comes to hanacha, when it comes to placing it down, the process already started. So to complete it, much less is needed, and that's why the Gemara asks it. The Gemara said, okay, maybe you don't have the answer for akira. Maybe for akira, you're going to be chai because it didn't happen at the same time, and therefore, you're not going to be chai. But over here, when it comes to hanacha, maybe less is needed. Okay, and that's why the Gemara asks it in both ways. Okay, says the Gemara tries to answer this question. Why does Rabbi Yochanan answer the question on his own? Now, again, before we even go further, let's try to understand what exactly is the question. The question is like this: the akira, the two things happening at once. The question is, do you see them? The question is, if they're happening at the same time, then maybe nothing happened. Or do you say, no, you could almost like freeze frame and see like two steps happening one after another, right? In other words, you have this clod of earth, let's say, that hits the ground and it makes it smaller, no longer 10 tefachim, right? So you had 10 tefachim, and then you put the clod of earth and makes it 9 tefachim. Do you say that first it entered this place, okay, and therefore you're chayav, and then after that it attaches to the ground, okay, and therefore now it's smaller, and the airspace is smaller, it's no longer Rishos Yachid? Or do we say, no, it's all happening at the same time, and therefore you're exempt? Right? So the question is, do you see it attached to the ground immediately, or do you kind of separate the steps? That's essentially the conceptual way of asking it, and that'll help us understand the next few lines. Tish Lami today. So Gemara says, why don't we resolve Rabbi Yochanan from his own statement? What are we talking about? It's done. We have a Mishnah. We're going to see very shortly. Hazorak arba amos bakos. The person throws something. The person standing 4 amos away from a wall. Now, when we transfer objects within Rishos Harabim, you need to move it a distance of 4 amos, which is about 8 feet, okay? So Hazorak arba amos bakos. The person throws an object a distance of 4 amos in the public domain against a wall. If it's above 10 tefachim, it's like you just threw it in the air. It's like it's suspended in the air, right? We spoke about many times. Above 10 tefachim in Rishos Harabim is meaningless. If it's lower than 10 tefachim, it's as though you threw it in the ground. And we know that halacha is if you throw an object on the ground 4 amos away, you're going to be chayv. The Gemara asks, at the end of the day, you threw it against the wall but never rested. In order for there to be a proper akira and anacha, it has to be stationary in the beginning, stationary at the end. If you throw something against a wall, it never rested 4 amos away. For Rabbi Yochanan, no, it did rest, but something which is very common in the ancient Babylonian world, and in Israel as well, in the times of the Mishnah, were sticky fig cakes. Fig cakes were very common. They're sticky fig cakes. So it's not a ball that you're throwing against the wall. You're throwing a fig cake. Throw the fig cake against the wall, it sticks against the wall, and it's not going anywhere. Ask the Gemara, Vamai, why should the person be liable? Right? What did we say? The person standing 4 amos away, the fig cake is over here, 4 amos away. They throw it against the wall, and now it's against the wall, which was exactly 4 amos away. But guess what? It's against the wall. It's jutting off the wall, and therefore there's something missing. Hakam might my arba amos. It reduces the distance. It's less than 4 amos, because if I was standing 4 amos away and now it's against the wall, it's jutting into my 4 amos. You've never really, the fig cake has not gone a distance of 4 amos. So what's the Gemara asking? The Gemara is asking that, again, the whole premise of the question is, do you see these things as separate steps or as one? The factor of Yochanan, the fact that the Mishnah over here says you're chayav, what does it teach me? What that means is that we see it basically becoming like attached to the wall, or really we don't see it, the opposite. We don't see it attaching itself to the wall. We see it as almost like separate from the wall, and that's why I'm going to be chayav. Whereas we don't see it attached to the wall, in which case the distance in Rishos Harabim is actually smaller, and therefore we should learn from here that we do not see things. Sorry, I just want to make sure I get this right. The fact that we say you're chayav teaches me that we don't see it really attached to the wall. We don't see it all happening at once. Rather, we see it happening at separate stages. The Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. Hasan lo mevatle, hacham mevatle. In the case of the fig cake, the person plans on, yes, you threw the cake against the wall, but you're going to come back later and eat it. When it comes to the clod of earth, it's really permanently attached. So the cases are not really comparable whatsoever. In the case of the clod of earth, it's really becoming part of the land, and therefore there's a question: do you see that happening first, it landing, and then becoming part of the earth, or do you see them as separate? When it comes to throwing it against throwing against the wall, we'll never see it really attached to the wall, and therefore we always see it as separate. Because at the end of the day, you're going to take it later. It's not really attached. And the whole question was really about earth, which is now going to become one entity. Okay, By Rava, another mind-bending question. Let's say you are in the public domain, and you have a pegs, okay, a bunch of pegs that are 10 tvachim high, but they're the right height, but they're not the right width because they're short pegs. Then you take a board and you throw the board and it lands perfectly, like flat, on these pegs. Now you have 4 tvachim wide and 10 tvachim deep, but you took the board from the public domain and it lands in something which is now created into the private domain. So Mike Mibay, asked, what's the question? This is exactly what Rabbi Yochanan was asking. Again, the board, you move the board from the public domain into now what's becoming a private domain at the same time that it lands. That's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan was asking. Can the two things happen at once? So Gemara says, no. We're talking about a case, where a person threw an object upon the board, right? What's the Dude Perfect, right? So this is like a popular show. They do all these trick shots. So the person has their board, right? They have their board, and on top of the board is an object. And now they're throwing them together. I'm not going to throw it because I'm going to drop it, but I throw it together and it's going to land on top of the pegs, right? And then, so it's landing at once. So regarding the board, that's the question Rabbi Yochanan was asking. But we're not asking about the board, that's Rabbi Yochanan's question. Rava's asking, what about the cup? Did I now move the cup from a public domain into a private domain? Or do we see them all as one, right? That's the question. So it says, since they're happening at the same time, it's like placing an object and making a partition. Odilma came into midla porta an impossible object on top, and the board does not lift slightly off the board. Right? When I throw two things, at the end of the day, there's going to be like a little bit of a gap of separation. It's going to land, and boom, it lands on top of it. So in that split second, do we separate those two, right? In total, we're asking when they're mamish, literally at the same exact moment. Here, we're throwing the board lands, creates a partition, it creates a private domain, and then a split second later, the cup, which was lifted a tiny bit, boom, it goes on top of it, and it falls. So the question is, Rav Yochanan was talking about a case where they're literally happening at the same time. The question over here is, there's a split second. Do we see that as separate? Do we see that as same? Teiku, the inquiry is unresolved. Amarava, pshitali. Okay, now we go a little further. Another one more of these questions. Amarava, pshitali. Mayim agave mayim haino anachasan. We mentioned earlier that when it comes to akira and hanacha, the object has to be stationary when I pick it up. If you have a moving object and I pick it up, it's not really stationary, then there's no akira. I didn't really lift it up. And similarly, when I put it down, it has to be landed. It has to really land. So if I go ahead and there's a well of water and I put my cup in and I pull up some water, so is the water stationary? He says, yeah. Water on top of water, that's considered stationary. Egos lagabe mayim, but if it's something which doesn't belong on water, like a nut floating on water, lav hainu anachasan on top of kuf amud aleph. Daf 100, amazing. Okay, so that's not considered a natural state of rest, and therefore I never really did an akira. By Rava, the question Rava asks is, egos bechli uchli tzaf lagabe mayim mahu. Then there's a nut, and it's in a vessel. Okay, so and the vessel is resting on water, floating on water. What's halacha? Mi'amrina basar egos azlina. Do we look at the nuts v'hanayach, and the nut is at rest on the vessel? O dilma, or perhaps basar kli azlina. We follow the vessel v'halanayach, and the vessel is floating on the water. Right? So which one do you look at? Do you focus on the nut, which is resting on the object, or do you focus on the fact that altogether they're really all in the water, and therefore it's not really a rest? Teiku, the question remains unresolved. Okay, one more. This one's not going to be an unresolved question, but it's another interesting conceptual question, and that is shemen al gabe yayin. If you have oil floating on top of wine, so let's say you have a cup over here, and imagine the bottom of the cup is wine, top of the cup is oil, right? They're not going to mix. And I go ahead and I put a spoon in, and I scoop up some oil. It's in, and let's say it's in the private domain, and I move it into the public domain. So was the oil ever at rest or not? So on the one hand, it's on top of the wine, right? And therefore, the wine is moving, right? And therefore, it's not really a rest. It's like the nuts on top of the water. At the same time, they're all together in one vessel. And therefore, do we see them as resting in this vessel? So the Gemara says, Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Rabbanan. This is a debate, a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. It's not. We have a halacha. Shemen shetzaf al gabe yayin v'nagat tul yom b'shemen lo pasa el shemen. Okay, so you have a case. You have oil of truma and wine of truma. Okay, oil of truma and wine of truma. They have a very high level of susceptibility to truma. And a tvul yom, a person who is just barely tameh, goes ahead and whatever, they're in the process of removing their tumah, and they go ahead and they touch the oil that's at the top of this cup. Okay, so the Tanakama, the Chachamim say, then it only impacts the oil, because the oil is seen as distinct from the water. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer Shneim Chibur Zelazeh. They're both attached. They're all seen as one, and therefore they're both tamei. So what does that have to do with our case? What it means is the Chacham would say that you only impact the oil, hold that the oil is distinct from the wine, and therefore when you scooped up that oil, the oil was on the wine. It was seen as two separate entities, and therefore you're not bichayev. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that they're both attached, and therefore all one entity, that means the oil was really resting in the cup, and the cup is stationary, and therefore it was resting, and therefore you're going to be chayev. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. All the best. I don't think I mentioned this in the beginning, but our learning was Leila Nishmas Mendel Mariam Maskal and Ruvain. And Neshama should have an aliyah.